Hello and welcome to the next of the video lessons on the British Political History course. Standard disclaimer, this does not cover all the specific evidence that you need. This is only for the analysis. You need to make sure you catch up on the specific illustrative evidence from the textbooks or the K drive, because the analysis is slightly more important. A bit of waste time just to go through. So, we're going to be looking at the constitutional crisis and the People's Budget of 1909. This is in and of itself a potential question, and the questions tend to focus on why did it happen, or why did Lloyd George and the Liberals win. So the background to the crisis is Balfour loses control of the House of Commons as a result of the 1906 landslide election. However, the House of Lords, which was dominated by hereditary peers, people who have inherited that title, therefore are part of the landed aristocracy, therefore by and large were conservative and rich, tended to be the preserve of the Conservatives. And in fact the House of Lords have been used to basically stop many of the liberal reforms all the way for the last 50 years. So Home Rule, for example, that was almost passed in the 1880s, but the House of Lords then blocked the bill. And there's nothing Parliament could have done, or Commons could have done. Balfour has a little bit of sour grapes. Now you can argue that this is a strategic move, that by using the House of Lords to block legislation, it was designed to cause frustration in the Liberal ranks, a feeling that the Liberal government wasn't doing enough, and therefore caused division between the more radical and less radical wings. Now, this is arguably what Balfour was thinking, although it's kind of flawed, in that people won't the groups who are getting frustrated by the fact that Lords are vetoing certain actions, will more often than not blame the Liberals but the Conservatives for this, and only make them clamour for reform, not necessarily dislike or split the party. But that was the idea, and essentially the House of Lords used its power to either defeat or add wrecking amendments, i.e. amendments which would fundamentally the government could not allow to pass. So, for example, saying you can have the pension reform, but you have to make sure that, I don't know, all poor people have to pay the same tax as the rich, for example. And obviously the Liberal government is not going to accept that, and therefore has to withdraw the bill. The House of Lords was not blanket in its condemnation, its rejection of bills. Education, licensing and plural voting bills, i.e. votes where you can transfer the vote, something that will help the Liberals, were all defeated. The first two, for example, were defeated because that would have angered nonconformists and the religious minorities within the Liberal Party, and then in theory made them angry and then agitate for change and therefore potentially split the party. And also they were not massively popular issues. Plural voting was voted down because that was too much of a help to Liberals that the Conservatives could not allow to happen. Now they did not block all bills. The pensions and social reform bills were too politically popular for the Conservatives to block, because it would have very clearly been a house of rich people essentially stopping poor people from getting what was essentially a moderate social reform. And Balfour was realising that he can block some stuff, but he still needs to get elected in the next election, which in theory would be in 1913. So in reality, not everything was blocked, but things which would disproportionately give the Liberals power, changing to electoral rules, or could be used to annoy factions within the Liberal Party and perhaps cause a split, they were encouraged. And so what happens is, through 1906, 1909, several bills meet their doom in the House of Lords. Now you can argue this is unconstitutional, but this is not new. Balfour is not doing anything new. This has been done countless times before by the Conservatives, probably not to the same amount or the same level, but that's as much because the Liberals were making more radical reforms in the space of a couple of years than Liberals had done in the last 20, and so, well, last 40 in reality. And so there's more reason and more occasions for them to actually have to veto something. So David Lloyd George has a problem. He can't get any things passed, and this is holding up the pace of reform. And increasingly, people are criticising the government for not making enough reform. Balfour's strategy seems to be working. So Lloyd George has to essentially find a way to get around this. Now there are two interpretations about what happens next. There is going to be a constitutional crisis in which the powers of the House of Lords are severely curtailed and will not stop liberal reforms again. Now you can argue one of two things. This happens by the constitutional crisis in and of itself happened by accident, but then David Lloyd George took advantage of an opportunity then to lead to a change in the powers of the House of Lords. So David Lloyd George was trying to sneak in some reforms by putting it as part of a budget, or David Lloyd George from day one was deliberately designing the people's budget to be rejected, to start up a constitutional crisis, which then will mean that he will have to destroy the powers of the House of Lords. Now it's up to you which of the two arguments you believe, and it's somewhat immaterial, but always keep these two arguments in mind. Essentially, by convention, not by law, because it's the British Constitution, the Lloyds could not reject finance bills. And they could only fully reject the budget and not amend it. Now, in reality, they will pass the people's budget. So David Lloyd George will pass the people's budget, and that will be blocked and held up by the House of Lords, creating a constitutional crisis. Now, one argument is obviously, therefore, that the people's budget, was a little bit excessive in terms of how much it was asking, the government to do, and how much it was power individuals. The role of the state was increasing and it was pushing more reform, but ultimately it's him trying to sneak something through, assuming that the Lords wouldn't dare reject the budget, and then when they did, he then took advantage of that to use this opportunity to force the Lords to reduce their powers, or he deliberately created the budget itself because he knew it would get rejected, and therefore it will start a constitutional fight. Now, this is the budget. I mean, you have to look at the specific examples, but if we have a go through, quite clearly, the budget is directly aimed at curtailing and costing the richest in society, i.e. the sort of men who would be in the House of Lords. The inheritance tax drastically affects people whose entire power, entire position in society depends on inheriting land and estates from their fathers and their fathers' fathers, etc., etc. Because if you lose 20%, 30% of that to inheritance tax, very quickly, over a couple of generations, your family will have nothing left. And this incomes over £5,000 were a part of a super tax, bearing in mind that a couple of pounds a year is for some people a salary. So it's not even aiming at the rich, it's aiming at the super rich, the people who owned landed estates. And that's very deliberate. People who earn £2,000 a year are very wealthy, very firmly middle class, probably even small businessmen. But deliberately making sure that they did not get hit by the income tax rise is very much something which is dividing society into them and us, i.e. the richest of the richest aristocrats and everyone else, and as well as the tax on motor vehicles, land tax, obviously the aristocrats owned land. Now, the people's budget is either one of two things. It is either very, very left-wing, because that's where the money needs to come from, that's what's fair, or deliberately designed to do one of two things. Deliberately designed to anger the Lords into rejecting it. So that's the idea that David George deliberately created this to do this. Or, and, number two, deliberately designs so that it looks like if and when the Lords reject it, they are doing it for selfish reasons. So this is very important, and it's very difficult for people to get a sense of. Essentially, if this was an accident, then it's a clearly, David Lloyd George has taken out his vengeance by taxing the rich very much, but ultimately there wasn't a political ploy. But that's not massively believable, in that this is so clearly designed at directly punishing the aristocracy and the House of Lords. That's it's too much, and particularly with David Lloyd George, who is not an angry, emotional man. He is a very, very shrewd political operator and calculator. So if we work on the assumption then that David Lloyd George has deliberately made this budget to upset the Lords, you've got to marvel at the genius of it. So let's break it down. The House of Lords are going to reject this. Now, if you're going to start a constitutional crisis, you want to look like the good guys, you want to make the others look like the bad guys. by taxing only the very, very rich and deliberately avoiding everyone else, including the businessmen, including many very, very wealthy middle-class people, but only taxing them, it looks, everyone else has no reason to dislike this budget, and it is very easy then to sell this to the public as well. This is the aristocracy refusing to pay their fair share. And this is the big, and this is very, very important to realise. Essentially, if David Lloyd George wants one or two things to happen: his budget to get passed, but also that the powers of the House of Lords be limited so they can never do this again, the only way those two things can happen is if an Act of Parliament is passed and the House of Lords agree to it. So essentially the House of Lords will have to agree to both go back on their rejection and limit their own powers. Now, they are not going to do that through persuasion. The only thing which is going to force them to do that is public pressure. If they are pressured, because they have so controversially and so clearly lost this argument, this constitutional crisis, that they are forced to limit their own powers. So you need to get everyone to basically, in England, to look at the House of Lords and say they're being unreasonable, they're being selfish, they are the bad guys here. So if you make a budget which the Lords reject, which annoys the middle classes, annoys certain groups in society, they are less likely to think that. They're more likely to go, actually the House of Lords are right. So you've got to create a budget which deliberately goes out of its way to make it look like the only people affected are the Lords, and they are being selfish about themselves. This is deliberately designed not to anger anyone else. This is not against the businessmen. This is not against the big industrialists. They are not affected by this. It is solely upsetting the aristocracy. And therefore, it's very difficult for the aristocracy to make friends of other people to support this because they're not affected. And it's very easy for Lloyd George to say, well, the only reason they're rejecting this is because it affects them. And therefore, Lloyd George gets the moral high ground. And that's the really important thing about the budget. If you assume that he is deliberately creating a constitutional crisis, he has deliberately made this budget so it's a constitutional crisis about something that he has the advantage over. It's very easy for David Lloyd George to point at this and go, it's us, i.e. the entire of the UK, versus the 200 to 300 aristocrats who actually will be affected by this and therefore have selfishly decided to reject it. So he has, if you want to sort of be Sun Tzu about this, selected his battlefield in which to fight. And arguably, the success of David Lloyd George starts here. After this point, it's for him to lose, as opposed to the Houses of Parliament, sorry, House of Lords, to win. Because in reality, it is very difficult, if you think about it, for the House of Lords to really use this as a way to get popular support. The only way the House of Lords is going to win this debate, really, is if it persuades enough people in British society that actually, no, it's going to be fine, and actually, you know, it's fine that they have rejected this and they've not done this selfishly. And the only way you're going to really do that is either be amazing at propaganda or have a budget where it annoys lots of other groups in society and you can use that to form a coalition. But this budget does not do that. So you can argue that, number one, this is clearly evidence that David Lloyd George intended the fight, or at least knew that there might be a fight on it, so was making sure the battleground, if there was a fight, would suit him. And you can use this as evidence, perhaps, that this battle over the constitutional crisis was already won pretty much from the beginning, because it's very difficult for the Lords and very easy for David Lloyd George from this point, if the debate is around this budget, because naturally it will lead to the Lords getting the rough end of the stick, looking like they're being selfish, even if arguably they're not. So this is the key point about the People's Budget. It is not just a random budget which is sort of appears. Arguably, it has been created with the potential to be rejected, and then this will enable David Lloyd George to say, look, I'm trying to help people, but the House of Lords are being selfish, and that's why we can't get all this nice stuff I've promised you. And that will naturally therefore help David Lloyd George. Now, in reality, the historical consensus is in between both of these. Essentially, David Lloyd George deliberately provokes the House of Lords by trying to get these reforms through, and he sees this as a win-win. Either they allow this People's Budget through, and then this means he can get his reforms done, or they set up a fight, and therefore he can win the constitutional battle. So in reality, it's likely Lloyd George wasn't really aiming for one or the other, but made sure he was in a position to take advantage if it got rejected or if it got accepted. That's very David Lloyd George-esque. So when we look at who's to blame, you can argue various things, and one of the key questions about this is who is to blame for the crisis. Now, you can argue the House of Lords have created this crisis by being selfish and anti-democratic, by not listening to the will of the elected people and doing what they think is interest because it hurts their self-interest. And any source from an official government position will advocate that these are selfish leaders who only care about themselves. A more subtle and nuanced approach is that the House of Lords made a strategic mistake. They should have seen that this was a trap. They didn't have to reject anything. They could have let this through and then just carried on rejecting the other laws, which aren't finance bills, and they have the right to reject. They've been doing it for 3 years, so there's not been a problem. Why would there be a problem going forward? Because in reality, the budget doesn't create reforms, it only funds the reforms. If you want more pensions, you're still going to have to. If you want more workers' rights, you're still going to have to get an act through which can be rejected. So argue the House of Lords wasn't necessarily selfish, or at least their primary mistake wasn't selfishness. It was the fact they let their selfishness make a strategic mistake. They let their selfishness blind them from the fact that this was clearly a trap, and then they fell hook, line and sinker into it, creating the crisis. Okay. Likewise, you can also blame Balfour. Balfour had been using this blocking and encouraging Lords to block the reforms. Arguably, he pushed it too far. Reforms here and there being blocked, but after a point, it gets a bit reckless, and he started, by the looks of it, they start blocking everything. And actually, he should have seen this as a trap. He should have used this blocking sparingly and only focused on stuff which he could have got away with, while at the same time trashing the opposition, and therefore causing splits. So that's how you can blame Balfour and the House of Lords. And you might want to separate them. You can say the House of Lords were acting independently because they actually didn't massively respect David Lloyd George. Lord Curzon, as in the Curzon cinema chain, was the chap who really controlled the Lords, and he was very anti-Balfour. In fact, he wanted Balfour's job. On the other hand, you can also blame David Lloyd George for this. Now, again, the two arguments are the arguments we talked about earlier. Number one, he deliberately created this crisis in order to force the House of Lords to reject the People's Budget, therefore, in turn, cause a violent reaction to the House of Lords' self-interest and blocking. Okay, so basically he deliberately designed this to be blocked, and therefore this will create a constitutional crisis which he knew he could win. The second argument is that actually he didn't intend to create a crisis, but once the House of Lords had rejected it, he realised that this was an opportunity. So this is him as an opportunist rather than a planner. And you can also argue in between. Like he thought there's a potential this might turn into a constitutional crisis, but he didn't expect the House of Lords to fall into such an obvious trap. But when they did, he had already prepared just in case, and therefore was able to push it. That's probably along the most sort of reliable lines, but who knows, because it's David Lloyd George's brain. So you can also, though, look at this as an inevitable conflict. British history from the 1830s up until 1949 is a story of increasing power of the Commons, decreasing power of the Lords and the monarch, as the country becomes far more democratic. So therefore you can argue that this is just part of that story. It was inevitable that more and more poor people, as they became more and more politically conscious, particularly they became poorer, they would demand more and more rights, and they would demand more and more reforms. And this would chafe up against the House of Lords, who represent the rich. And at some point they were going to reject something which the people think they deserve. Now, in 1830, the people aren't organised enough, politically conscious enough to be upset when the Lords reject anything. But by 1900, they're in a far more organised, literate, politically powerful position, so they may well reject it. Okay, and that's a key idea, that actually there was always going to be a clash. Like, the Lords could not forever carry on rejecting stuff it personally did not like because it was popular. And all what happened was this was the particular issue, but it would have happened any time. The argument could say, actually, it wasn't inevitable then, it could have happened 20 years later, 10 years later, 10 years before, but this was the trigger. Perhaps David Lloyd George triggered this trigger. You can also argue that actually the crisis was inevitable, less so as part of a story of how the House of Commons and House of Lords increasingly battle, and with House of Commons increasingly marching towards the democracy we have today. By the way, you could describe that sort of history as Whiggish. Instead, you can say it's inevitable, but because of the dramatic increase in the size and role of the state that new liberalism requires, about the role of the individual and taxation requires, naturally the much more laissez-faire and philosophically conservative House of Lords will naturally dislike this, and that will naturally lead to a constitutional crisis. Essentially, it is such a radical break with the past, new liberalism, in the role of the state, it will not naturally slowly become accepted because it's being so much changed so quickly. There's going to be a reaction, and because the House of Commons is so clearly new liberal as a result of 1906, and House of Lords, because it hasn't changed in generations, is so obviously not, that means that there will be a constitutional crisis. Because the philosophies are so different, the House of Lords cannot help itself but reject legislation, therefore created a constitutional crisis. So the three major arguments, therefore, are House of Lords or conservative errors, DLG being insidious and or provocative, and the idea that there was always, the House of Lords was never going to be powerful forever. There was always going to be something which made it have a battle and therefore lose its power. So, in reality, it's fairly clear that to some extent, that it says the who affair, so it's the whole affair, that to some extent this is a constitutional crisis. Okay, rather than the Tories just rejecting a particular piece of legislation, the whole thing was sold as who has the power. Is it the Lords or is it the Commons? Who has the right to have their view heard? And therefore made it into a far greater issue about power. This could have been focused just on this bill. I want this bill, I don't want this bill. The problem with making it a debate about the bill is some people actually might like the Liberals but dislike the idea of having so much tax and the Liberal reforms. If you make it about who controls the country, the elected Parliament, House of Commons, or the unelected House of Lords, you're far more likely to get people sympathetic to your side. Because pretty much everyone, apart from the Lords and a couple of stole-right Conservatives, basically like the idea that the Commons are in control, not the House of Lords. So by painting it as a constitutional issue, rather than making this an argument about what should happen to the bill, then you are... And David Lloyd George is making sure that he is getting as many supporters as possible. Now, the important thing to understand about the constitutional crisis, as I've mentioned already once this lesson, but I'm going to mention again, is the idea that ultimately the only way this crisis will be resolved is if the House of Lords gives in. For the budget to be passed, the House of Lords have to accept it. For there to be constitutional change to the powers of the House of Lords, the House of Lords have to vote it through. Without that, you physically can't get anything done. The Lords will not do that on their own back. So the only way to do that is to put political pressure onto Lords, force them against their will to pass the budget, which they actually do in 1910, but by that point the budget doesn't matter, it's about the constitutional powers. Instead, force them to also accept a limitation on their power, okay, and that they have to vote to accept the law which limits their power. So, in order to do that, this pressure will come from one of two places. It will come from the popular support of the masses. If the masses are, by and large, resolutely against the House of Lords, then they will feel the pressure to make the change. As well as this, the monarch has a lot of moral authority over the Lords. The Lords see themselves as patriotic. The Lords see their relationship with the monarch in very feudal sort of turn of the 1400, 1500, well, 1400, 1300 sort of era, the idea of they have loyalty to the crown. The crown is seen as far more august, far more respectful, and far more worthy of deference than a prime minister, who's very often a member of the Commons, or at this point always a member of the Commons. So therefore, David Lloyd George's approach to get the mass support to pressure the government is to go out to the people and push a mass campaign. This means speeches, this means flyers, this means going around and organising political parties, political groups or unions, all to really push this message that this is a constitutional crisis created by the Lords because they are selfish. That message, that story, which if there is ever a source question on this question, will have one of the sources pushing this argument, is designed so that the political pressure on the Lords increases, because people will naturally go, well, that's really bad, I'm going to support Parliament, I'm going to support House of Commons. What happens during the budget crisis, which we're not going to cover, is that process. All the statistics and the facts you're reading about this as part of your facts is all just David Lloyd George putting pressure on the government. So instead, putting pressure on the House of Lords, apologies. Essentially, by having a public campaign where you have lots of speeches, you are generating popular support. That popular support then translates into popular pressure. The elections are basically showing that the government has the support of the masses to carry on this fight. By having the support of the masses in the first election and then again in December, they are proving that the masses agree with the government that the House of Lords should be reduced in its power. And that's why after the December election, the King says to the House of Lords, well, the mandate has been proven. The Liberals are still the party of government, even though they have had 2 elections, even though this has been a major issue. If the public did not believe that the House of Lords' power should be reduced, they would not have voted the House of Lords in. So you have 2 choices now, House of Lords. I either make enough peers who are liberal so that it gets passed, and you will never be able to block anything else again because the House will be full of liberal lords, or you have to accept this, accept the limits to your power, and then basically keep as a conservative dominated house which will still be able to have some influence. And naturally the Tories, apart from a couple of symbolic holdouts, agreed to this latter negotiation and capitulate. But what's important to realise is the only thing which has forced the King to make that move, the King doesn't like David Lloyd George, the King doesn't massively want to damage the House of Lords, is this idea that the masses are not happy, and in a true democracy the masses matter. And the only thing which has made them not happy is the public campaigning, is the actions of David Lloyd George, is the fact that this debate has not been about who's a boring them versus us in terms of rich versus poor. It's been them versus us, as in the aristocrats versus everyone else. And it's been about the selfishness of the Lords. And it's been about a really nice series of packages of promises that everyone's going to benefit from, which the Lords are stopping. By making the budget such a treat that the Lords have rejected, it is therefore much, much easier to get public support for, and then in your speeches to sell public support for. So the arguments of either side, David Lloyd George and Liberals, as well as and Lords, fall into a couple of broad categories. The Liberal argument is very populist. This is about the people versus the elites. Lots of rhetoric about rich old men having too much say, and it's very much them and us, sort of rich and poor, but the rich being the richest 0.2% as opposed to the richest 10%, just the aristocrats. There's also an argument that it's a democratic thing. Does the voice of the elected representatives matter more, and therefore the public, matter more than the voice of the Lords, or the Lords, these private rich men, matter more? So it's this idea of, in order to finish the democratic reforms that have started since 1832, you need to support this and support the government in fighting the Lords, because otherwise you cannot have a truly democratic system without having the power of the people being first. You can also argue that it is a reformist system, the idea that the government is trying to reform society and make it more fair. This is mainly aimed at left-wingers, and the only way you can do that is by reducing the power of the Lords, because they've proven that they are so anti-reform. And the important thing to realise all the way through, though, of all these arguments is, although, as we shall see, they go relatively left-wing and very anti-rich, they're always very careful not to paint it as rich versus poor. Because if they antagonise the industrialists or the middle classes and make it simply rich versus poor and very socialist versus non-socialist, then they're going to lose that support. And without the industrialist and middle class support, A, the Liberals will find getting elected next election harder, but also B, to some extent, the public pressure will be less because the middle classes won't support the government's arguments. So what happens instead, as we shall see, is the arguments are very much unearned, lazy, aristocratic income is bad, whereas the hard-working worker, the hard-working middle-class clerk, the hard-working industrialist who actually makes money and makes business and takes risks, they are the good guys. So it's not rich versus poor, it's aristocrat versus everyone else. Now the Lord's argument isn't just I want this. They really argue that this is unconstitutional. And their big issue, well, it's twofold. Number one, that it's unconstitutional for a punitive tax. And they argue that the tax is so clearly aimed for the rich that it is a punitive tax, i.e. a punishing tax. And that is unconstitutional under numerous legislation under medieval kings. Doesn't really push that well. There's a slightly more rational and reasonable argument is that in order to do the land tax, which is one of the parts of the people's budget, you have to have land inspectors. Land inspectors have to be empowered by the state to go into people's land, even if they don't want that person to be there, and judge the value of the land and ascribe a value to it. Now, before this point, the idea that the government could send someone onto your land without a particular warrant from a judge had been sacred. Every Englishman's home is his castle, the idea is. The idea is essentially private land is precisely that, private. No one else can tell you what to do on it, no one else can go on it without your permission unless they have a court order, which is very, very hard to get. In order to do this land reform, you need valuation agents who don't have court orders because they take too long. And this therefore arguably fundamentally changes the relationship between the state and the individual. i.e. the state can now go onto your land and walk around without your permission, even though you have not given it that permission, and therefore suggests that the state actually has more power over you. So it's a much more based on that sort of argument. The Lords, though, are not very politically savvy. They make this constitutional arguments, but they don't try and really appeal to the mass electorate or try and tailor their message to particular groups. It's relatively an inept campaign where they basically say this is bad, we're not going to change our mind, it's unconstitutional, but they don't actually try and get the masses on board because they don't massively understand mass politics, and they're nowhere near as good at it as David Lloyd George. So in reality, although there's this message, it's a very weak message and it doesn't really convince many people. Now, one of the most quite famous examples, this is breaking the rule of lacking specific evidence, is the Limehouse Speech. And that sort of summarises David Lloyd George's approach of this populist, this reformist, but also, if you look at the end, supportive of the rich. Now, you can have a read of this in your own time. It's very much sort of populist, them versus us, rich versus poor. But read the last paragraph. These capitalists put their money in, and as I said, when the cast failed, what the landlord put in? He simply put in the bailiffs. The capitalist risked, at any rate, the whole of his money. The engineer puts his brain in, the miner risks his life. I.e., the capitalist is a good man, he risks something. He deserves reward. The engineer, that's upper class. Middle class engineers puts his brains in, and therefore he deserves something, appealing to the middle class. The miner, the working class, risks his life, and he puts something in, so he deserves his reward. But what has the landlord? And this isn't landlord in terms of slum apartment, this is the man who owns all the land, i.e. the rich aristocrat. This is a divisive them versus us, but not simply rich versus poor, aristocratic versus non-aristocratic, and you really need to pick this out. It's not simply attacking the rich, it is trying to really isolate the lords away from the mass of the population, because that's the only way you're going to get a mass political pressure against the House of Lords, if they're on their own and everyone else is against them. So the chronology, you look in your own time, budget rejected, speeches in newspapers magnified the issue. You can argue that this is therefore created by David Lloyd George into a wedge topic or a wedge subject. A wedge topic, very simply, is something where you're either for or you're against. You cannot be on the other side. And by making this a constitutional issue, you're either saying the House of Lords can reject laws that it does not personally like because they're selfish, which is, let's be honest, no one's going to agree with that. Or you are the House of Lords must listen to the will of the people, the House of Commons. That you're obviously going to agree with. So naturally, by creating a wedge issue, but a wedge issue where naturally David Lloyd George is going to win, it therefore means that already from day one he's pretty much likely to win, and it's just about keeping up that energy. There's a constitutional crisis, there's the need for 2 elections. George V, when he becomes the king halfway through 1910, says, I'm sick of this crisis, if you can get elected again, I will make the peers. That they get elected again. They just about win with the help of the nationalists, and therefore the Liberals get the Parliament Act 1911, which severely curtails the power of the Lords. And you can look into all of this in far, far more specific details, and you will need to illustrate your points. So why did they win? Ultimately, David Lloyd George understands what the game is. Okay, he understands from day one, arguably before day one, he set this up well in advance, that the only way it's going to be changed is through popular pressure. So you need to create a crisis in which it is very easy to get the sympathy of the public on your side. Now you can argue that that's what he does, and he does that very successful. The Lords and Balfour didn't really have a strategy about how to fight this, how to get people on their side, how to stop the political pressure. All they did is repeat the argument that it's constitutional, which to most people is a very esoteric, distant, not very compelling or exciting argument, therefore it doesn't get much support. Okay? Therefore you can argue that actually it was the failure of Balfour and the Lords not to have a strategy. Overall, though, you could say British history since 1832, arguably since Magna Carta, has been a slow decline of the power of the monarch and the Lords, and an increase in the power of the people and the Commons. And you can say, therefore, there was going to be a fight at some point, and overall, it was inevitable that the Commons were going to win, because that's the trend of history since Magna Carta, is that people get more and more and more powerful. Well, not since Magna Carta, but you know, get the idea. And then, therefore, there was obviously going to be some sort of showdown at some point, because the Lords would never willingly get rid of all their power for free, and this just happens to be it. The counter-argument to that is, well, that's probably true, although nothing is inevitable in life, but that's probably true. But did it have to happen in 1909? Okay, or did it have to happen so sharply, as in we had one crisis and then Parliament and then the House of Lords pretty much loses all its power? It could have happened later, and the resolution could have limited the Lords' power, but much less, and it would require another crisis and a little bit more, another crisis, a little bit more. It did not have to be so sudden and so sharp. So therefore, David Lloyd George and the Liberals arguably precipitate the crisis. It is helped by the fact that the Lords don't actually manage to fight it off that well, but you can argue this is part of a trend in history where it was always going to happen. So what were the effects of the crisis? Essentially, there are some short-term effects and long-term effects. Short-term effects are arguably good for Liberals, long-term effects less so. The Parliament Act 1911 basically destroys the Lords as a political force. They cannot veto legislation, they cannot wreck legislation, they can only delay legislation. Therefore, although they will still retain some power, and there will be further acts, for example in 1949, in reality they stop being the most important house, really. I mean, they never really were for the last 50 years, but there's no way, shape or form they are now. Okay? The fact that the Conservatives and under Balfour were so associated with defending the aristocratic rich men over the poor did not help this image that they were the party of the rich, the party of old money, the party of the past. And they are the party of elitism. And this only really reinforces that image. And this does a lot of damage, arguably, to the Tory party, and in fact can explain partly the decisions Bonar Law will make all the way up until 1923 in not trying to form their own party. And this, bear in mind, is happening at the same time in which the power of the working classes and the rights of the working classes to vote is only getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and seemingly getting to the point of universal manhood suffrage. And therefore, if you're the party of elitism, that's really quite bad, because in theory, you should be destroyed by the electoral changes as soon as the masses get the vote. It also ends Balfour's career. He's been making far too many mistakes. The loss of the government was bad enough, the tariff dispute was bad enough, but he was rightly blamed for to some extent being reckless and precipitating this crisis, and then not having a plan how to deal with it afterwards. He was replaced by Bonar Law. Bonar Law being picked because no one knew what his stance on tariffs was. There was one chap who they wanted, who was far more qualified and experienced, but he was a free trade trader, so therefore the protectionists didn't want him. There's also another chap, same thing, but protectionist, very good chap, protectionist, and free traders didn't want him. They picked Bonar Law because he is a relatively quiet, unknown man who was very good at keeping a consensus to the party. Okay, he was a consensus builder, not a massive leading public politician. His job was to keep the party together and heal the divisions, not necessarily win elections. The other changes, though, arguably are more negative, in that what had been stopping several major issues, women's rights to vote, for example, but most importantly, more significant social reform, and more than that, Irish Home Rule, was the assumption that the Lords had always rejected it and would carry on rejecting it. It is therefore pointless to try and change Home Rule. Now that the House of Lords are dead as a political force, the argument that there's no point trying to get Home Rule because the House of Lords will defeat it does not work. And this then starts really agitating the Irish nationalists and Sinn Féin and the Irish, that, well, if the only thing stopping us, you have been saying the reason you haven't been doing it, haven't been pushing for Home Rule, is House Lords. If now that's gone, you should be doing it, right? And this puts a lot of pressure on the Liberals. This, combined with the fact that after the December 1910 election, the Liberals lose their overall majority, and therefore to rule they have to have an Irish nationalist help them. This means the Liberals have to push Home Rule. They don't want to push Home Rule. They know it's going to cause all sorts of problems. But now, because of the fact the Lords are no longer a bloc, and the Liberals are now dependent on the Irish nationalists, there is much more push for a Home Rule bill. And similarly, because the power of the Liberals is declining, the LRC and Labour get stronger and more confident and get more aggressive, and therefore get more anti-Liberal and start drifting away from the Liberals and to carry on entertaining the idea that they'll have their own party. Another random effect, just for reference, is it reduces the number of election cycles from every 7 years to every 5. So that's the constitutional crisis of 1909. The big message is, who is it who starts it? There's argument all round, but ultimately you should always, the key thing the examiner is looking for is for you to understand, why is the budget being constructed as it is? Why are the people reacting as they are? And why do the masses matter so much? If you can answer those questions, rather than just give the story of what happens, but explaining what the force is shaping it, you will do very well on this question. And it is a very nice one, so you want to hope this one comes up. Anyway, next week, next lesson, we are doing the women's rights, I believe. Until then, we will see you in the next video.